Welcome to Wells and its Cathedral. Wells is the smallest city in England, and it's bestowed with a beautiful cathedral. You catch a little glimpse of it here, but we're going to go inside the cathedral later. First of all, I want to take you for a little walk around the town, or the city as it should be called, because it has a cathedra in the cathedral. Please contribute to the making of this and other videos. These are free to you, the viewer, and of course it does cost a little bit of money to make them and run around doing the research and the development of them. Thank you very much in advance. Let's go on into the great city of Wells. Population somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 people. This is a view of the town square. It's a market square today, very often used as a car park, as many of these are. But have a look around, have a look at the stores, the storefronts, some of the architecture, people milling around during this COVID crisis. But also, if you can just see it on this portrait view, you can see the curb, the gutter that runs all the way around the market square. It's very square. You may have to zoom in on it, but it's a very square gutter. There's a reason for this, and I'm going to explain that to you in a moment. It's a very relaxed day today. We're going to enjoy a little walk around the city and the cathedral, the interior of the cathedral, in just a few minutes. So first of all, a little context. As I'll be walking around Wells and the cathedral, I want you to understand what an English town or village is. I've already made reference to the fact that Wells is a city. It's a city simply because it has a cathedral in which is a throne, the bishop's throne, which is called the cathedra. It gives its name to the cathedral. Only in England does this rule apply, but in England, if you have a town or a village or a large city with a cathedral in it with a cathedra, it is technically a city. There are just one or two minor exceptions to this. Essentially, Wells is a village of between 3,000 and 4,000 people, even though it has that illustrious title. And here in the village, there is a market square. The market square is surrounded by some beautifully ornate shop fronts, as you would call them. Originally Tudor, Georgian and Victorian style facades still clutter around this lovely little village square. But I made note of the fact a moment ago that if you look at the gutters, it's very difficult to see it on the video, but if you look at the gutter all the way around this village square, it's a very square, very wide gutter. This is because churches, historically at least, would try to control the resources. It's a way a way for them to make their money. This is a great money-making project. Building a cathedral, you need a lot of funds, you need a lot of resources. So let's control those resources to create the funds, either the land, the water, or even the people, a resource. Here in Wells is a very, very stark I guess throwback to previous times. This gutter that I keep referring to is very square for a reason. On market days, market controlled, if not owned or chartered by the cathedral and its authorities, the market would be run and it would attract people both to buy and to sell, of course. It would be held here in the village square, and that would have been the case for 1,000, 1,500 years. Now, there was one particular bishop, a man called Bishop Beckington, who was quite a bit of an authoritarian. He wanted the money to flow into this great church, and he came up with a wonderful new device. He would actually make the streets flow with wine. So what he actually did was, around the market square, he dug a trench. And behind the walls that you'll see in a few moments, there is a freshwater spring. Yes, the church controls the fresh water here in this part of Somerset. So on market day, not only would he release water into the streets to enable people to fill up their flagons, to allow their animals to feed and water themselves, he would actually pour some very, very cheap Bordeaux claret into this flowing water and allow people to collect water from the streets, from the gutter here in Wells. Of course, that would attract people to the village of their own volition, as opposed to the laws that mandated that they should come. You have the laws, the stick, and then you have the wine running through the streets, the carrots. Control the resources, control the people. There's the gutter that allowed the bishops to turn water into wine. So there's a last glimpse of the village square, the market square. We're going to go through this beautifully ornate gateway here. It's called Penniless Porch by the locals. This is where the bishop would come and pass out alms money once a year to the congregating flocks. And they all stand here at the entrance to what is an enclosed area. This is actually part of a large wall that goes all the way around the cathedral and its grounds, as well as the bishop's palace. We'll visit the bishop's palace in a little while. But here we are walking through Penniless Porch, very ornate, and stepping into the bishopric, essentially, the cathedral-owned, occupied, tenanted property. Now, much as this is flagstones, here on the right-hand side is actually the entrance to the cathedral. You don't go through the main doors anymore. The cathedral, as are many cathedrals in Britain, is nothing more than a museum piece, a gallery. They have services, certainly, but are sparsely attended. They are museums to all intents and purposes. But there it is. We're going to walk across the green and have a good look back at the cathedral. But this green, you have to remember, this is the west front of the cathedral. The green itself, once upon a time, was a cemetery. So it's very, very peaceful today. It certainly has always been peaceful, simply for that reason. There we are looking back at the west front of the cathedral. We're going to do a little swing around here. This whole green area is occupied or tenanted today by about 20,000 people. 20,000 people are buried underneath my feet as I speak. You can pan around, you can see some more of the architecture surrounding Cathedral Green. I was very lucky a number of years ago to be here with a group, and there was an archaeological excavation going on here by a group called Wessex Archaeology, and they were trying to find out just how many people were buried here beneath our feet. There's been a church on this site, a stone church on this site, since the 700s. A man called King Einar founded the first Saxon church, stone-built Saxon church here on this site. He also founded Glastonbury Abbey and Bath Abbey and church. A man who turned to Christianity and put his money and resources into building great buildings for his religious persuasion. I have to say, though, he didn't give the best land. Of those three, they are all sitting on what was once upon a time swamps and marshes. So these people beneath my feet would have been in very soggy accommodations for much of their immortal life. Nowadays, also, Wells Cathedral is known as being a cathedral and music school. A lot of young people pay a lot of money to come to the school here. Some of them are boarders. Some people come to live in the village, and their children will go to school because of that, because of the location. And if you look around here, these old buildings that surround the green, many of them are occupied by classrooms, by pupils' quarters. Here we are looking back towards the cathedral. It's a beautiful visage. It's not the largest cathedral in Britain. It's certainly one of the prettiest. More than 300 great stone statues decorate the facade and the sides of the cathedral. That's the highest proportion that you'll find anywhere in the United Kingdom, possibly Europe. A peaceful day here in Wells, one or two people idling their quiet moments. This chap looking up at the great walls of the cathedral. Here's a chance to see some of those stone sculptures that I mentioned and the very ornate stonework. Wells Cathedral is an example of English Gothic, very ornate, very decorative. It's slightly later than European Gothic, simply again a coincidence of history. But because it's slightly later, the knowledge and understanding of stone building was better. So they could build higher, they could build more innately. Columns are thinner and more decorative, simply because they're understanding tolerances and stress loads a little bit better at this point in time. When you're talking about a generation of people, the difference between European and English Gothic, only about a generation of people, but the knowledge and understanding of stonemasonry was much better at this point in time. And Wells is the first example of all English Gothic. There's a glimpse back towards the green. Now I want to show you something. We're going to walk through that arch in a moment. This arch goes across the road. It connects the cathedral to something very special, and I'll show you that in a moment. Many of you have been here with me and you know what's coming. But hold your breath. I'll talk about it in a moment. I'm panning the camera around. Again, some beautiful decoration. Great stone masonry. Behind this structure is the chapter house. The chapter house here is up on the first floor. You can catch a glimpse of that in a little while as well. And panning slowly around here. At Wells Cathedral there's a clock. And there's a clock face on the inside and the outside of the church. I'm just going to catch a glimpse of it now. There we are. It's the second oldest clock in probably the world. The oldest is at Salisbury Cathedral. The only problem is at Salisbury Cathedral it's really just a cog system on a floor inside the cathedral itself. Here the clock works both inside and out. So it dates back to the 1300s, 1340s, and it's a marvellous, marvellous structure. You catch a glimpse of it inside. Hopefully we'll catch it ringing in a little while as well. These steps, they go up over the road. We just saw from the outside this corridor that's built across the road. Those steps are very important to the people who lived here in this enclosed area. It's enclosed now. This was built in the 1300s. This entire street was built in the 1300s. The chimneys that you see that look quite modern, they're actually dating back to the 1500s, which means that this entire street, there we are, we're looking up it, we shall walk down it in a moment, is medieval, and it is the best preserved medieval street in Europe. At least that's what the church authorities will have us believe. I've been here many, many times and all over Europe, and I agree with them. It is a fabulous piece of English heritage. We're going to take a walk down here in a moment. This street is called the Vicar's Close and it's owned by the church authorities. Today some of the students live here, they reside here, they board here as they go to school. Students being from 11 to 17 years of age, both boys and girls today. And this street was built specifically for the choral society. Back in the 1300s, the church deemed it necessary to have their own choir, and many of the clerics, the young clerics, men of course at that point in time, would have lived here in purpose-built accommodation.
Have a lovely day.
Now, of course, they're young men, and they're well-to-do young men, because these were the second sons of great families. Not going to get the title or the money, so they come here to live in sumptuous wealth and take on a religious persuasion. So they would have a certain amount of luxury afforded them, and here we are today in the 21st century looking back at how they will have lived. Of course, it is an enclosed area. There were actually gates and guards making sure that these young men were locked in at night. Hence the steps up over the streets. It means their only recourse in the morning is to go to their prayers early in the morning, middle of the day, late at night, and they would have to go over that up that staircase, over the street, and directly down into the main nave of the cathedral itself. Of course, young men have a will in a way, and by bribing the guards, they could make their way out into the village if they so wished. And of course, we all know what young men like to do, don't we? Nothing changes. This was the first structure built, and this was for choral practice. These young men could come here before the steps were built. They could come here and practice their choral skills, the singing skills. I can't take you inside, I'm afraid, because it is still used by the church authorities. But again, a gorgeous example of medieval architecture. Slightly changed and adapted through the centuries, 13, 14, 1500s essentially. I've been here on many occasions where people have been singing or practicing musical instruments. Nowadays, of course, music, as opposed to just choral practice, music is the focus of the school authority here, attached to Wells Cathedral. And there's a very well-renowned school. Wells Cathedral School of Music is second only to the Henry Purcell School of Music here in Britain. And of course we have a pretty good culture of music in the UK as a whole anyway. Now we're looking back down towards the cathedral, back down Vicar's Close, and we'll take a little walk down here. The red brick building on the right-hand side, that's a shell around one of these 1300s buildings, one of these 14th century buildings. It's a brick shell, and it's a little more substantial than all of the other dwellings here. It was built for the dean, so originally it was the dean's quarters. The cobbles that you see here now are not original. They date back to Victorian period. Obviously in the Victorian period people wanted to keep their feet clean and dry. If we go all the way back to the 13, 14, 1500s, this would have been a clay covered area, nothing more than that, quite muddy, quite dirty. But still, by the standards of the day, quite luxurious. There's the Dean's house right there on the right hand side. And you'll see these little plaques, you can just about make them out, up high. Little heraldic shields on the chimneys and on the buildings. That's because the church didn't pay to have these structures built, even though they organised and arranged for that to happen. If you were a wealthy patron, a businessman, a merchant, a landowner, you could donate to the church, to the cathedral, and pay to have one of these built in your name. And therefore, a small plaque showing your heraldic device would be carved into the structure itself. So originally into the house, but then of course in the 1500s when the chimneys were built, another plaque would be placed up there simply because it would be a new donor, a new patron, donating the funds to have the chimney built. Why was the chimney built? Because this area went from burning in wood to burning coal. There are coal mines just up on the hills behind Wells, and coal became the fuel of the day. And the people here knew that coal dust would come out of the lower chimneys, as were there originally, and settle in this enclosed area, choking them. So they decided to extend the chimneys up into the air to enable Mother Nature to blow that coal dust and grime away. They knew what they were doing, I suspect, and of course they had the money to do it. Here's a glimpse of the gateway. I mentioned prevented young men from leaving the confines of Vicar's Close, but also to prevent young women from entering. And we know what sort of women we're talking about. In a town or a village such as this, or Glastonbury, that had a large church with a lot of young men with wealth, it would be a magnet to ladies of ill repute. So it's an old-fashioned term. But they would have been clawing at the door outside to get inside because the business was there. How do I know that? Because the churches kept great records. They're the people who can read and write. They kept records of this. They knew where the money was going. They knew what the money was being spent on. We know to the pint how much these men were drinking on a weekly basis as well. Were they celibate? Yeah, depending on the century, it would depend on the century whether or not it was required to be celibate. There were a number of bishops here who were actually married during the course of the life of the church. And then, of course, at other periods, it was frowned upon. Now we're going to leave Vicar's Close and head back down towards the cathedral. just a couple of minutes walk away. As I say, the two structures are connected. This building here is also owned and used by the church. There's a small museum next to it. Just going to pan the camera around gently. One last look. That's the staircase that goes over the road. There it is. And there, that strange structure behind the staircase, that is the chapter house that I mentioned earlier on. Now, normally when I give this tour with my groups, my Rick Steves groups and my private groups, I'll spend an hour, hour and a half giving a guided tour around the grounds of the cathedral itself before we go inside. And then I split the group into two. And we'll have docents or guides inside the cathedral who will actually give the guided tour of the cathedral that morning. But this is a place that's very close to my heart. I love Wells Cathedral. I grew up in this area. And this was my, I guess you could call it my local church to a degree. I never went to church. I did go to a church school, but I never went to this church. Until a little bit later in life, when I was a teenager, I used to come to Wells, and a friend of mine, his father was a lecturer here at the school. We would prepare for our examinations in the chapter house. We'd sit in the chapter house and we'd fire questions at each other, history, geography, you name it, and we'd test each other, quiz each other, do a lot of our study and revision up there. Here on the green, we would play cricket. A group of us would come down and we'd play cricket on the west front of the cathedral, and rather than measuring out the length of the cricket pitch, we could eyeball it, because the distance between the two doors is 22 yards exactly, which is the length of a cricket pitch. And here you are, you can see a lovely view of the front facade of the cathedral. Very ornate, beautiful limestone, buttery limestone in this area. Recently underwent renovation in the 1980s. They spent many millions of pounds protecting and restoring some of the statues, and here we are, a lovely view of some of the statues. Church dedicated to St Andrews. As I say, nowadays most of these great churches are almost devoid of anything but visitors. Certainly we have pilgrims from overseas who come, and there's a small congregation of people who attend church here regularly. But I'm talking a very small number of people. The church was originally built to house, to accommodate thousands of people standing. But as you'll see, empty today. This is the entrance to the cathedral. We're going to walk inside. That's my colleague Charlie Rawson, also a Rick Steves guide. Just saying hello to the docents here. Interestingly enough, some of you know I live in Brittany nowadays. The young lady behind the glass screen here at reception is also from Brittany. So when I come with groups, she and I, we always have a little chat and perhaps even a cup of coffee. We talk about the news in the cathedral.
I've never been in.
And Charlie, she's never actually been to Wells Cathedral. So this is her first time. I'm glad we got her down here today. Let's go on inside. It's a beautiful building. This is one of the few churches in Britain that I find to be quite warm inside. Many of these great structures are austere. During the Victorian period, a lot of the whitewashing that had taken place throughout the 14, 15, 16, 1700s. A lot of the whitewashing of the walls inside these great churches was removed by the Victorians. It was an endeavour to take these lovely structures back to their original form. Unfortunately, what they didn't realise is that there's an awful lot of beautifully ornate painting underneath the whitewashing. So their great scrape, as we call it today, did untold damage to the surfaces of these great cathedrals and churches throughout the length and breadth of Britain. So nowadays, when we look at the interiors of these structures, we see stone, as you can see here on either side of me, and sometimes even reproduction whitewash, or painted plasters, as I prefer to call it. The stone is lovely here in Wells, which is lucky. In other parts of Britain, it's quite grey or dark red or even purplish coloured granite. But here is this lovely bushy limestone, and as we pan the camera around, you'll see why I call it a warm cathedral. Look at this. It's beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. The X-shaped arches there at the end, we call those the scissor arches. You'll see those again in a moment. Built by a man called William Hocking in the 1500s. The cathedral was in fear of collapse. As I said earlier on, King Ina gave his poor land away, so this is marshy ground. And all three of his great churches have been in danger of collapsing. This is the only one actually that still stands completely, and the others have lost a lot of their structure because of time, of course, but also because of damage due to land movement. So those scissor arches by William Hocking. He was a Devonian, that's where I was originally born, although I haven't spent a lot of my life living there. He came up with this wonderful concept to help strengthen the walls. But I get away from myself again. Look at these walls. I'm going to be quiet and let you enjoy this for a moment. So English Gothic in all of its glory. Look at these columns, not a single column as you see in so many cathedrals and churches throughout Europe. Here we have lots of perpendicular, very narrow columns. They build up the strength by adding to it and can keep it very decorative. This strange structure here on the right hand side, this is a chantry chapel. Today you see the cathedral without any pews. They've removed those because that's what cathedrals would have been like. There would have been open places and there would have been stalls, marketplaces would have been inside these buildings. People could sell things in them, trinkets perhaps, but also animals. Animals were brought into them. These were very, very busy enclosed areas. Of course, the church controlled all of the trade that went on here, but you, if you wish, could pay to have people chant over your mortal remains. So these chantry chapels, that was one that we just saw, you would pay to have that constructed inside the cathedral, and then you would pay the church to have a priest or priests pray over your soul, or pray your soul through purgatory to heaven, and you would put a lot of money in trust for that. But a cathedral like this with all of its open spaces could have dozens of these chantry chapels. There are only two that remain here in Wales. Most of them were destroyed or were removed in the 1500s because the whole idea of chantries became frowned upon by the King of England at the time, King Edward. And many of those chapels were removed and the trust funds went with them. So at that point in time, the churches such as this had to find other sources of income. It had many, but that was one of their main sources. Those trust funds were gone. And some churches, Wales included, found themselves quite hard pushed to pay the bills. And one of the things they then resorted to do was to remove the brass from the tombs that were buried into the crypts and into the floor of these cathedrals. They'd remove the brass and sell it. Yes, religion was not then what it is today, I guess is the best way of putting it. We're looking at a wonderful wooden statue there, and the clock above it. So I mentioned the clock on the outside. That clock is gorgeous. The statue is built by a man who survived the Second World War, a man called Frankel. He was a prisoner of war, German prisoner of war, and he decided to stay here after the war. And he made Wales his home, and he created this beautiful sculpture in recognition of the hospitality that the people here in the village gave him. The clock above it is quite interesting. Obviously it's very old, but it's an astronomical clock. Above it, you'll see some movement in a moment. There is a fascinating little enactment that will take place. Watch this. So the astronomical clock, as old as it is actually very complicated. It doesn't just tell you the time of day, it also tells you the time of the month and the time of the year accurately. And it's been doing that since the mid-1300s. Now we've just walked past the chapter house. I'm going to give you a glimpse of that upstairs in a moment. It's closed today, there is a function going on up there. We're going to carry on walking down past the choristry, which is on the right hand side. There we are. We're going to a little glimpse inside of the choristry. There are a lot of events going on here at the church today. This is the chapter house. Look at these stone vaulted ceilings. There's a central column, we're looking at it, that goes straight down into the crypts underneath the church, and it supports this entire ceiling. This ceiling is stone. This is not a wooden chapter house ceiling such as you find in every other cathedral in Britain. This is a stone vaulted and fluted ceiling, and I think it's absolutely gorgeous. The width of that central column, by the way, is 1.5 meters. It's maybe 5 meters all the way around, and the acoustics in this room are amazing. Sorry I can't take you up there today, but as I say, there are functions going on, but there's a lovely view of the ceiling itself. We're going to carry on walking into the eastern part of the cathedral. These tombs that we see on the right-hand side, these sarcophagi or copies of sarcophagi on the right-hand side, they're all defaced. The noses of the figures depicted in them have been removed. Removed because defacing, that's where we get the word from, was popular during certain Protestant periods in British history. They come into churches like this, they destroy the windows, they destroy the statuary by defacing, removing the noses so they're unrecognisable. Protestantism in Britain basically meant that idolatry was taboo or frowned upon. So anything that portrayed a face or a figure was idolatry and had to be removed. And that's what happened here. These stained glass windows are beautiful, but there's not a lot of medieval stained glass left here. Or rather, there's a lot of medieval stained glass left here, but it's not in the right order. This is a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. You can see on the left-hand side, no real imagery there. 1 or 2 modern replacements, heraldic devices, but not a lot of real imagery here, because the coloured glass had been broken by soldiers during different periods of Reformation. Still pretty today, absolutely lovely today. We're at the far eastern end of the cathedral. Again, beautiful stone vaulted ceilings here. On the left hand side, just a quick glimpse of it. There's a lot of people gathered around it, so I'm going to keep moving. Days of COVID and all that. Is a coping chest. Now that coping chest, we know because of dendrochronology, dates back to the original Anglo-Saxon church that was here in the 700s, which is very interesting because that coping chest, you can't actually get out through any of the doors of this existing cathedral, which means that the cathedral was built around it. So that coping chest has a little bit of a story. Coping chest, by the way, if you're not sure what that is, it will contain the vestments of the priests here in the church itself. The choristry on the right-hand side is beautiful. It has a lot of Victorian timber work, beautifully carved, hand-carved timber work, and a lot of great tapestries as well. But so we can't go in there today. As I say, functions. It's often the case when you're on tour with tour members. Is even more problematic because they want to see these things, but very often we can't. Other things are going on. These churches are living places. They have functions that must be attended to. Here is a close-up of Hocking's scissor arches, and you can see it's not just at either end of the nave. It's also at the entrances to the east and west apse, to the north and south apse, I should say. Here we are. Again, light shining into the cathedral. It's absolutely beautiful. And I'm heading towards the cloisters. Now, I mentioned outside that the church controlled the resources here in the area. All churches control resources. That's why they're built. That's how they generate their income. Here is the spring. Remember, the town is called Wells. That tells you that here in what was once upon a time saltwater marshes, there was a freshwater aquifer bubbling up out of the ground. And people need fresh water. I guess we all know that, don't we? Well, the wells that the place name refers to are right here in the middle of the cloistered area. Bubbles up out of the ground. On the left-hand side, and is enclosed by the cloisters. The aquifer is actually just on the right-hand side through this wall. Now I'm going to slow the camera down a little bit now, because on the left-hand side you can see a doorway, and you'll catch a glimpse of some ruins on the ground, which is all that's left of the old Anglo-Saxon church. Now, to give you some ideas to age, the Anglo-Saxon church was built here in the 700s. But before that, there was probably a wooden structure dating back and going back into Roman times. Why do I say that? Well, because where you see that little blue awning, there are some Roman remains. There's a Roman villa on this site. And quite possibly Romans who practiced the worship of the new religion, Christianity. Little shrine there. Anglo-Saxon church was built up on the same site, and of course this medieval church was built over the Anglo-Saxon church. Continuation of history. The layer cake of archaeology and history in Britain is wonderful. And great churches like this tell that story well. These plaques on the walls here, just memorials to the late and the great. There aren't people buried in the walls. There are some people buried underneath floors, and of course out in the cloistered area as well, as on Cathedral Green to the west front of the church. The whole area around the cathedral is enclosed, as you'll see once again in a moment. But right now we're going to make our way out of the cloisters, and we're going to head down towards the home of the man that ran this place, essentially. The seat of power, the bishop's palace. Au revoir to my Breton friend behind the reception desk there. And there's the gift shop, of course, there's the gift shop right next to some toilets. Strategic location as you leave. The only way you can leave, past and through the gift shop. I think you all know that. Anybody who's listening to this knows that. That's the way it works. So we're now exiting the cathedral. You can see the spires there. There's the west front. One last look. Now this archway that we're going through takes us through another wall. This wall is also to the side of the village marketplace. We've gone through that wall. Remember, that was a gate. You have gates and walls for a reason. It's to keep people out or to keep people in this case to keep people out. So it's a form of defense. So we come from the market square through a defended gateway. Now it's very genteel, it's very lovely. There's some grounds laid out here. You caught a glimpse of the cathedral again there. But look, there's another gatehouse in front of us. So we've gone through one gatehouse, and here's another one. Highly defended, you may say. What's not apparent to you at the moment, but will become apparent in just a minute, is the fact that these gates and these walls, remember a second layer of defense, are protected by this. It's a moat, and it's fresh water. This fresh water is bubbling up and it swims around what is the bishop's palace, but it doesn't get out into the village until market day, when it's released for the local people to use. And this was perpetuated upon the local population for hundreds of years. It's called the feudal system. I keep on referring to it and about it to my tour members, because you have to understand what the feudalism was to the people who lived here in Britain for hundreds of years. It was totalitarian state on steroids. And it was the aristocrats, certainly, but it was the church, a theocracy, a theocratic state that ran things. They had their own law courts. The chapter house would have been used as a law court. The church made its rules and regulations, as did the King of England. But you can see by the layers of defense that this man needed protecting. Nowadays it's very gentle, and we have swans on the moat. If the swans ever leave Wells Cathedral, then England will fall. It's funny how that myth is copied throughout England. The ravens at the Tower of London, of course, is another example. Now here on this gatehouse wall, you might just be able to make it out. Underneath that window, there's a rivulet cut into the stone that goes to the water level. That's because that's been eroded. Until very recently, there was a chain hanging off that window that reached water level with a bell on it. When the swans wanted feeding, they'd ring the bell. Of course, that chafing of the chain against the wall through centuries has meant that there's a little narrow channel now being carved into the stonework underneath that window. And because of preservation and protection now, they've removed the bell. And we're going to go through this gate into something rather special. We're going into the bishop's palace. So here we are, as we exit the gatehouse, we come into this grassy area, very often used by croquet clubs here inside the bishop's palace. But if you look around, you see these walls, these high walls again. It looks like a ruin, doesn't it, over there? You see the great Gothic arch in that wall. It's not a ruin. This is the bishop's palace, only it was never finished. So we're standing in what would have been a large living area of the bishop's palace at one point in time, had it been finished. Nowadays, there is just the one element, if you like, of the structure that was completed, and that's now used for storage, for administration by the cathedral authorities. And of course, down here where the bishop and his family perhaps will have lived, certainly his courtiers will have lived, there is just a cafe, a coffee area. These steps take you up to the chapter house and over the road that we saw earlier on and down into Vicar's Close. I think it's a gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous piece of architecture. Look at this, fabulous stonework. These steps are well trodden. And up there on the right is the chapter house. We saw an image of that earlier on. Please contribute to the making of this video by clicking the PayPal link either below or above, and many, many thanks. I hope you enjoyed this short tour through Wells and its cathedral. It's a lovely place. Come and visit yourself one day. I hope you do.